Galactic Football League superstar Quentin Barnes hired Frederico to find Quentin's parents. In this episode, Fred orchestrates a covert meeting so he can deliver the results of that investigation in a face-to-face meeting with none other than the Ionath Kraken's quarterback himself. The worlds of the GFL, Dinolition, and Fred's underworld existence collide in The Detective, episode number 6. Welcome to the serialized audiobook, The Detective. Written by Scott Sigler and Matt Wallace. Narrated by Scott Sigler. Hello, junkies. Welcome to The Detective, episode number 6. I am hard at work on so many books. Deadlines are shifting. Deadlines are colliding. A lot of you have questions as to when the stories you want will be coming out. After the episode, I will give you the latest on Galactic Football League Book 6, Aliens Phalanx, and the Earth Corps sequel, Mount Fitzroy. For now, let's saddle up and ride into battle with The Detective, episode number 6. Book 3, Wilson 4. Chapter 17, Quentin. The roar of a stadium crowd filtered into the empty bathroom, played off the tile walls. Fred had his hands deep in the nanite machine's inner workings. He was trying to fix the fabricator. He'd put up the out-of-order signs to keep people out. Then, while he waited, he checked the machines and actually found a broken one. As long as he was here, he might as well fix the thing. It gave him something to do and added to the disguise's effect. He tilted his head, letting the long, fake beard fall out of the way of his hands. The beard was one of his favorite prosthetics. Nothing could change the shape of a face faster than a mess of hair, but it did get in the way of close-in, delicate work. In addition to the facial appliances, Fred had caked his face and neck heavily in flesh-colored makeup to hide the aftermath of his near-death experiences on Micovi. Quentin didn't need to see just how deep this thing had gotten. He heard someone enter, heard the tread of feet on the tile floor. Big feet. "Excuse me," Quentin said. "I need to use the facilities." Fred looked up from the machine. There stood the physical specimen that was Quentin Barnes, quarterback of the Ionath Krakens, all 7 feet of him. There was no one with him. Fred had half expected to see Bobby Brobst, Gredoc's main bodyguard and hitter, or possibly some more Quith warriors, but Quentin was alone. The elaborate setup had apparently worked. "You surprised me," Quentin said. "I thought this Dinolition thing was legit, but you set up the tickets?" Frederico shrugged. He had arranged to have the Dinolition commissioner send Quentin 4 VIP tickets, knowing that Quentin's buddy John, Uncle Johnny the Awesome Tweety, was crazy for the sport. That proved to be incentive enough to bring Quentin, John, and their dates from Ionath to Wilson 6 in the Planetary Union. "Rachel Guessford owes me a favor or 3, Fred said. "I had to contact you while you were away from Ionath, make sure no one I knew was trying to reach you." Fred recognized the look on Quentin's face. A look of hope. Quentin had hired Fred to find his family. Fred had succeeded, but the news wasn't something any 20-year-old orphan really wanted to hear. The look of hope changed to one of concern, of trepidation. "Fred, are you okay? I know how much you like to play dress-up and all, but is something wrong?" Even through the beard and the other bits of the disguise that made Fred look like a 50-year-old man weighed down by a lifetime of manual labor, Quentin had picked up on Fred's emotions. That was spooky. The kid had a real knack for that, almost like he was a human equivalent of a Quith leader. Fred nodded. "Yeah, someone doesn't want me to find out about your family. I spent the last few weeks ducking some pretty heavy hitters." "Who were they? Gredoc's gang?" Fred shook his head. "I wish I knew. I can't say for sure if they're his goons. And they're not the only ones. That little reporter piece of fluff was also on Micovi, digging away." "Piece of fluff? You mean Yolanda Davenport?" Frederico nodded. "That's the one. I was at Micovi Stadium, seeing if the Raiders had any info on your past. She was there." "Did she see you?" A reporter spotting Fred working a case? That would be the day. "Quentin, please." I'm a professional."
What was she doing on Micovi?
"Digging into the history of Quentin Barnes, just like me. Just like the heavies I ran into."
She find anything?
"I don't know," Fred said. "I don't think she found much. She seemed to be looking for real specific stuff about your time with the Raiders, not about your childhood. The hitters, on the other hand, they wanted the same info I found. They always seemed to be just a step behind me."
"So, you did find something?"
That look of hope returned, stronger this time. The kid was good at reading emotions and could hide his extremely well, but he was still so young. Most times, those emotions got the better of him, and his face was an open book to his soul.
"Well, come on, Fred. Out with it."
Fred couldn't look into those eager eyes anymore, not with the information he had to deliver. He looked down. Fred hadn't known his own mother, but at least he'd never held on to the hope that she'd been alive, out there somewhere, looking for her baby boy. "You sure you want this, Quentin? Are you sure you want to know?" Quentin took in a long breath, then let it out slowly.
"Yes, I want to know. All of it."
Fred thought of Quentin as a kid, but he wasn't. Barnes was so big he had to angle his shoulders a little to fit through some doors. He was the starting quarterback of a Tier 1 football team. Quentin was young, sure, but he was man enough to make his own decisions. He had hired Fred to find information, and if Quentin wanted that information, Fred couldn't pretend the man was a child. "Okay. I managed to find a family record based on DNA. I used some of your blood."
"You didn't ask me for my blood."
Fred shrugged. "You're religious. Who knows what you superstitious primitives think is sacred?"
"I bleed all the time on the field, Fred. You really assume I would think blood is sacred?"
"There's no logic in religion, Quentin. Anyway, if you said no, I would have been out of an option, so I went with it."
"And where exactly did you get my blood?"
"Nanocyte patch back in INF Stadium. Not hard to come by, Quentin. As you mentioned, you bleed a lot. You knew a guy in Micovi named Sam Sargsian, ran a barbecue restaurant?" Quentin's eyebrows rose. Clearly, he hadn't thought of Sam Sargsian that much lately.
"Yeah," Quentin said. "What's he got to do with it?"
"Nothing. I met him, though. He said you like to eat. A lot." Quentin smiled.
"I weigh almost 400 pounds, Fred. Of course I eat a lot. You're just stalling. Come on, tell me."
Fred sighed. The kid was right. Fred didn't want to give this information and had unintentionally tried to change the subject. "You're right, I'm stalling. The Purist Nation records are scattershot at best. Their technology's about 400 years behind everyone else's, but I found the death record for your older brother." Quentin nodded. The news didn't surprise him, because he'd known his brother was dead. The status of all the other family members was a mystery to Quentin, but at just 5 years old, he'd watched his brother hang for the crime of stealing bread. "Turns out your name isn't Barnes," Fred said. "At least, not originally. Looks like your family changed names. I'm not sure why."
"What was it?"
"Carbonaro," Fred said. "I found it on your brother's death record. Your brother's death record led me to your mother and father. I could find no official death record of your father."
"What was my father's name?"
"Killian Carbonaro." That damn expression of hope flared on Quentin's face yet again. Now Quentin had a name. A name made things real. Even without a face to go along with it, a name probably made the poor kid think his father might be out there, somewhere, and not be just another rotted body in a sky-high stack of unknown corpses in grim Tyrant Valley.
"That's a start," Quentin said. "And my mother?"
Fred had actually hoped the kid wouldn't ask, but that had been wishful thinking. Her name was Constance Carbonaro. Quentin swallowed. He licked his lips. Fred knew what question was coming.
"And she's—"
The kid couldn't even say it. Maybe he knew, or at least he suspected it. Time to put those hopes in the ground. "She's dead, Quentin. I found her record. It's accurate, no question. I'm sorry." The big man's shoulders sagged. He looked down. In the bathroom of second-rate Smithwick's Arena in the wastes of Wilson 6, Quentin Barnes had finally learned that his mother was gone. "There's more," Federico said. "You told me about your brother, but you said you didn't have any other siblings." Quentin nodded. He kept a straight face, trying to hide his emotions, but Fred didn't need to be a quiff leader to see that the kid was devastated. "Why did you tell me that? Why didn't you tell me you had a sister?" Quentin's eyes snapped up. I don't have a sister." Fred felt a wash of excitement, a touch of happiness at bringing some hope back to Quentin's handsome face. There was something about that kid, something that made you want to help him. "Well, if the records are accurate, you do. Janine Carbonaro. She's about 10 years older than you. She would have been 15 about the time your brother died."
"And my sister's record? Did you find a death record on her?"
"No, but I found one on your other brother that you probably never knew about." Should Fred tell him? No. Quentin could hide his emotions, but the kid didn't need to know about Quade Carbonaro just yet. Fred shook his head. "Don't get too excited, okay? Just because I didn't find a death record doesn't mean
that she's alive. I know," Quentin said. "I get it, Federico. You can stop repeating that, okay?"
Fred nodded. "Right, sorry. It's just, well, you wouldn't be much of a poker player, Quentin. I can see the hope in your face." Quentin's face went instantly blank, like someone had flipped a switch and shut off his emotions. Spooky. With a bit more practice, Quentin would be able to hide any emotion. Damn spooky.
"We're not playing poker," he said.
"It's the eyes. A dead giveaway every time."
"You're not going to start talking about how pretty my eyes are again, are you?"
Fred smiled and shook his head. "No, not at all." He thought back to the first time he'd met Quentin. Fred had donned a pink suit and played the role of an over-the-top, effeminate gay man, hoping to expose Quentin as a homophobe, just like the rest of his Purist Nation countrymen. Fred had done that because he wanted a reason to turn down Quentin's business, a reason to ignore the kind of money that a Tier 1 quarterback could pay. The act had disturbed Quentin, sure, but the kid had owned up to the fact that a gay man made him uncomfortable, owned up to it, and immediately tried to deal with it. What's more, he'd been transparent about that, honest about it. Fred had never expected such behavior from a 19-year-old nationalite. "To tell you the truth," Fred said, "when we first met, I did that just to get a rise out of you. You're okay looking by the numbers, but you're not really my type."
"I wish I could say I was offended by that."
The roar of the crowd made them both look at the door. Fred nodded. "You need to get back to your date. If you want, I'll keep looking for more info."
"I do," Quentin said. "Just find whatever you can. Even death records give me some idea, you know?"
Fred nodded, then turned his attention back to the broken nanite machine. It would take another 30 minutes or so to fix it. Then he'd catch his flight to Jupiter. Red Storm City awaited, and, hopefully, so did Janine. Book 4, Jupiter. Chapter 18, Rico. Sometimes Fred wore the disguises. Sometimes the disguises seemed to wear him, to consume him, to push his actual self down so far that it was a little hard to remember what was real. That had happened with the Caleb persona. It had happened with a few other disguises as well, but there was one disguise that took him over so completely he didn't want to come out of it. He didn't want to come out of it because it wasn't really a disguise at all. It was a younger version of himself. Rico walked down the streets of Red Storm City. He'd docked several hours ago, when he'd been Fred, not Rico, but something was nagging at the back of Fred's thoughts. That note. Actual paper. Aged paper. It had seemed so convincing. A little detail, something that made things seem real. No, not convincing. It seemed romantic. Not in the kissing sense, the relationship sense, but the bigger sense of the word. Romanticism, a grand, sweeping story that seemed larger than life. At first, the paper had sold him, but the trip from Micovi to Jupiter gave Fred time to think. The paper. It was too romantic. It made Fred wonder if Carney was the aw-shucks miner he seemed to be. Maybe someone had got to him. Maybe this trip to Jupiter was a setup. Maybe someone wanted to kill Fred, and this trip would be his last. That's why Fred stepped onto the transport at Micovi, but Rico walked through the streets of Red Storm City. His first stop had been to a human clothing store. What he found wasn't an actual flight jacket, but it was close enough. The smell of leather. That helped him slide further into his past, as did the goatee and the sunglasses. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he realized that Fred was the disguise. This was the real person. The things Rico had lived through. Well, that was because Rico couldn't be killed. Rico's second stop took more time. He let his instincts take him to the right area, almost like he could smell the thing he needed. He tried a convenience store, then a gambling parlor, then a brothel before he found what he needed in the offices of an unlicensed doctor. He paid 4 times what it was worth, not that it mattered. It wasn't his money, after all. When he put the spun steel composite revolver in his pocket, Rico felt better. 5 shots, no bigger than his hand, but it would blow the back of a man's head wide open. Newly armed, he moved on to his third stop. Rico rarely drank on the job, and it was his policy never to get drunk while on a mission. Yet he couldn't deny he was starting to tip slightly the wrong way as he downed his 5th shot of the night. It was frustration more than anything else. He'd walked into half-timers at an hour that apparently marked a shift change in Red Storm City's manufacturing district. The place was packed with loud, working-class sentients, mostly human, mostly wearing one kind of Jupiter Jack's paraphernalia or another. Some of the gold, silver, and copper shirts, hats, and coats were beat up, marked with dirt and grease, and looked like they'd spent decades conforming to the bodies of their owners. There were other teams represented as well. The Red Lightning of the Hurrah Airspace League, Stormcloud FC, and an occasional shirt that supported one of the Dynolition teams. Rico didn't mind the crowd. In fact, that's what he'd wanted. He needed as many employees on duty as possible so he could search for Janine, and he wanted to be able to hide in the crowd while he did it. Rico found a corner that gave him a view of most of the bar. He started drinking because he had to drink something. Few bars have patience for non-drinking customers, and if he sat there for hours sipping a soft drink, that would arouse suspicion. A quiet man drinking alone in a bar didn't attract attention, nor had it for several centuries. By the end of the 3rd hour, Rico was convinced Carney had sent him on a wild goose chase. Rico had struck out with every single server, bartender, and cook in the place. Not only was Janine not among them, no one had ever heard of her. No one could place the name, the description, or the backstory Rico laid out. Even if she'd given false information, something should have stuck with someone, even a tiny detail. Still, nothing. Rico knew Fred had been a fool. Fred was hopeful. Fred was optimistic. Fred thought people were good. Rico knew better. He knew that people were garbage, and everyone was either out to get you or to take something from you. A total waste of time and money. Rico knew that maybe he hadn't been needed after all. Maybe it was time to put on the Fred disguise again. Let Fred handle things from here on out. And then Rico saw him. At the end of the bar, out of the glaring lights, looking inconspicuous despite being so big, sat a human. Bobby Brobst, Gredoc's main hitter. Bobby Brobst, who had a flexi-cast on his right pinky. And just like that, Rico knew. It had been Brobst in the records room on Micovi. Brobst had been the one who nearly choked Fred to death. Rico took him in. Bropst's build and heavy brow bordered just north of heavy G country. He looked like a perfect thug in that way, a classic leg breaker. But his eyes were sharp, calculating. That made sense. The human who tried to put Fred away back in the records room had been more than strong and fast. He was cagey. Rico didn't flinch. He didn't stare. He didn't change his behavior in any way. Bobby was looking around. Bobby was supposed to make that as transparent as Rico made it, but Bobby wasn't as good at the game as Rico was. Most everyone didn't realize Bobby was there, but to a pro, the big man stood out like a face with two noses. It was no coincidence that Bropst was here, in Red Storm City above Jupiter, sitting in the same bar where Carney had told Fred to come and find Janine. That changed everything. It brought the last few weeks of Fred's life into sharp focus. Rico knew it meant that his Fred disguise was no longer flying under anyone's radar. Fred had suspected Gravedigger might be responsible for the Quith warriors in the desert, and Fred had been right. There was no Janine to be found here. Only death. Bropst looked Rico's way. For a moment their eyes met, then Bropst kept scanning, kept looking. He didn't recognize me. Rico waited until Bropst turned to scan the other side of the room, then quietly stood and walked to the door, using his skill at moving without drawing attention, without bumping into anyone or making sudden moves that would catch a hunting eye. He didn't bother trying to scope out individuals who might be ghosting his movements. Everyone in this place might as well have been an agent for the Splithead. Once outside, Rico kept walking, kept looking. On the other side of the curved radius road, he saw a pair of Quith warriors sitting in a grav cab. They were watching half-timers. And above, a Creterakian civilian circling in a non-random pattern. Extra muscle and eyes in the sky. Bropst hadn't come alone. Rico never slowed, never sped up, just kept moving at the same pace. He crossed the street. He looked for and found another bar, one with windows that looked out onto the street that gave a view of half-timers. He gave a drunken Quith worker a 100-credit chip to leave a table next to the window. Rico sat. Rico watched. Rico waited. Now, marginally safe from the trap, Rico relaxed. His work was done. As he relaxed, he faded away, allowing Fred to come to the surface again. Fred watched. Fred waited. It had been Gravedigger the whole time. It was Gravedicker's warriors in Raider Stadium, and in the desert trying to blow him up. Ghoulie was working for Gravedigger. Gravedigger wanted the same information on Barnes that Fred had been hired to chase down. Why? That was the question Fred asked himself over and over as he waited and watched from across the street. 1 hour became 2, and then Fred's patience paid off. Bobby Bropst walked out of the club alone. He nodded to the thugs in the grav cab. They drove off. Bropst didn't climb into a private car. Instead, he headed up the street away from the club. Bropst was dangerous, sure, but he was also making mistakes. A guy that big could delude himself into thinking he was a better player than he actually was. Bropst shouldn't have been alone, and Fred wasn't going to let that mistake go unpunished. Fred shadowed Bropst from a comfortable distance for a few blocks before snaking across the street. City night had fallen, the dome protecting Red Storm City darkening, casting the street in shadow. Bropst walked into a dingy hotel. Fred waited a few minutes, then followed him in. From there, it was a scene Fred had played out a dozen times before. Quietly give the hotel clerk a chunk of change, in this case, 500 credits, to get Bropst's room number. Bropst had been at that bar for hours. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't stopped for food on the way from the bar to the hotel. Fred used the stairwell to go to Bropst's floor, then waited for room service to show. When the waiter came, another 500 credits meant Fred got to deliver it. Fred waited until the waiter left the hallway, then he knocked. Bobby Bropst opened the door, expecting to see his food. Instead, He was looking down the barrel of a small revolver. "Hi, Bobby," Fred said. "We need to talk." Fred poured 2 glasses of vodka. The first one he rose in a silent toast to his new friend, then knocked it back. The second glass he held to the lips of Bobby Brobst. Bob couldn't drink it by himself because his hands were tied to the arms of a metal desk chair. So were his ankles. So was his waist. Hey, he was a big guy, and Fred didn't want to give him any room to maneuver. Bobby was no dummy. He knew this might be his last taste ever, so he drank. "Thanks," he said. "My pleasure." "My ass is getting tired from sitting here," Bobby said. "You got me all tied up, so it's your show, but can we get this over with?" "What if I'm going to kill you? Do you still want to get it over with?" Bobby swallowed. He licked his lips. "Like I said, my ass is getting tired, so whatever you're going to do it." Fred sat on the bed. He casually pointed his gun at Bobby's chest. "Sure," Fred said. "Let's do it. What does Gravedigger want with Quentin Barnes's family history?" Bobby just shook his head. Fred stood. He pressed the muzzle of the pistol against Brobst's temple. Bobby still didn't look scared, but it was clear he didn't like having that kind of tech so close to his face. "I don't think you'll do it," Bobby said. "Killing me doesn't gain you anything. I've been studying you, Gonzaga. You're in it for the money. You're smart enough to know that if you kill me, more people are coming after you. People even besides Gravedigger. Maybe even my brother." "Do you have a brother?" "Do you really want to find out?" Fred smiled. "That's good. You're smarter than you look, Bobby. But what if I don't kill you? What if I just beat the hell out of you until I get what I want?" Bobby licked his lips again. He sighed. "I'm no fan of pain, but I'm trained to manage it. I don't think you've got what it takes to go far enough to get anything out of me." Fred's eyes became as hard as the metal chair. "Are you sure about all of that, Bobby?" There might have been a sliver of doubt in Bobby's eyes, but he didn't break. He just sat there in silence, staring back. Fred took one more shot. "How did he rig the phony letter from Quentin's sister?" Brobst still didn't answer, but for just a split second there was a twitch in his brow, as if his eyes were about to narrow. It was gone just as quickly, but Fred recognized the micro-expression. He realized it was confusion. Brobst didn't know about the letter. He hadn't been involved in that part of it. "You were here to kill me," Fred said. "Gravedigger told you where I'd be, and you were to take me out, right?" Bobby looked at the floor. He knew his next words might spell his end, but he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." Fred took the muzzle away from the skull. It was a hard reminder that had things gone slightly different, had Fred come as himself instead of letting Rico take over, Fred could be the one in that chair or already be dead. "How long you been waiting for me?" 6 days, Bobby said. "I was cleared to wait another 4. Carney. They had used Carney to get Fred to Jupiter. They just hadn't known exactly when Fred would arrive. "You're right, Bobby. I'm not a murderer, strictly speaking, and torture isn't my bag, but none of that is going to be necessary. You've been a big help." Brobst frowned. "Even if you don't kill me, this is damn embarrassing." "You owe me," Fred said. "You know I could waste you right now. I'm not going to do that. So you owe me." Bobby looked up. "You're assuming that even if I agree, my word is worth something." Fred shrugged. "Hope springs eternal. Only time will tell. Throw in another platitude if you like, but maybe we'll never find out. Oh, and you're not getting away completely scot-free, big fella." Fred whipped the pistol in a sideways arc, slamming the butt into Bobby's temple. Bobby's head rocked back. He stiffened, then sagged, unconscious. Fred taped Bobby's mouth shut. He left the man strapped to the chair, grabbed his bag, thumbed the Do Not Disturb icon, and pulled the door shut. Bobby would be there a day, 2 at the most, before someone came in to clean the room for the next guest. By then, Fred would be on his way to Micovi. Fred would have the rest of the day, and maybe the next, before any message from Bobby could reach Micovi. Hopefully, that was all the time Fred needed to find Carney, get some answers, then get the hell off that piece of crap mining colony before Greedock sent more trouble. That was episode number 6 of The Detective. This episode was GFL-rific. It didn't just have Quentin Barnes. It also had Bobby Brobst, one of Greedock the Splithead's heavies. Super fun to to see some of these secondary characters step up and have moments within the novellas. Now, Fred's dalliances with organized crime are going to continue into next week. You have to ask yourself, who will he run into? You'll have to download episode number 7 to find out. Now, before the episode, I told you that after the episode, I would give you an update on where we are on 3 huge, gigantic, gigundous Sigler properties. First of all, the thing we are working on right now is Aliens Phalanx. They went to DragonCon in Atlanta, sat down with Steve Saffel, the editor at Titan Books, who have hired me to do the Aliens book. This is a canonical Aliens novel. Those of you who have followed me over the years know that my absolute love for the movie Aliens, I've seen it over 100 times, in my opinion, the single best movie in the history of film. It's that good. And I get to write in that world. We are busting our butt. We did a really, really solid first draft. Came back from Steve, got to go to DragonCon, sit down with Steve and go over the pros and cons of that. And now we are banging away on a second draft. It is going to be intense. It is going to be riveting. And ladies and gentlemen, junkies of all ages, it is going to be gory. This will be the goriest book I think I've written since Infected. And if you guys have heard my novel Infected, that was no walk in the park for those of you with weak stomachs. So when I finish this draft of Aliens, which should be done sometime in mid-September, that goes back to Titan. I don't have details on when Titan is going to publish it, but it is up for pre-order right now. Aliens Phalanx, you can go on Amazon.com. You can pre-order that if you want. It is going to be worth your money. I highly advise it. Then we are dealing with the deadline for Mount Fitzroy, which is the sequel to Earthcore. Again, the first draft completely done. We're going to dive into the second draft, which the first draft we had a huge outline for. Did a lot of pre-work. Have had a proofread or a canonical read by our editors, our timeline editors, the Siglerverse editor, John Vizcarra. And so we got a huge amount of work done on Fitzroy with a lot of notes. Chris Grawl, our military consultant, also went through it. Science consultants have gone through it. It's in a very, very, very advanced first draft to start with, and then we dive into the second draft and start to clean that up. I still am not allowed to tell you who's publishing that. That is, we have a moratorium on that information. As soon as I can tell you, I absolutely will. We're still looking at a 2020 release for that. Wait, what year is this? Hold on, I gotta check. I don't even know. Bro, I don't even know. I don't even know what friggin' year it is. Well, anyways, it's going to be out sometime next year, whatever year this might be right now. It's going to be pretty awesome. It's going to be pretty awesome. We don't know who's going to read it yet. We're hoping Ray Porter. We will find out. And then GFL Book 6. GFL Book 6 also in final draft mode. It's super cool. You guys are going to just dig the crap out of it. Will we see Frederico in it? I can't say yes or no to that right now. But we're also hoping that'll be out sometime next year. So an enormous amount of work has gone into getting these things to the advanced stages they are in. Now coffee is for closers, and we are trying to close these bad boys out and get them all to you. And we hope you guys are super excited about that. Sorry there aren't more details, but we'll have the details for you as soon as we can. Don't forget Siglerfest 2K19, our 9th annual Siglerfest is coming up in Las Vegas in October. Go to scottsigler.com/Siglerfest. Take a look at that information. Please consider coming to join us. If you are a hardcore Sigler fan, trust me, you're going to have the time of your life with other Sigler fans, with the Director of Doom, with me. It's possible the Dogs of Doom will show up. We can't say for certain at this time. That is it for this week. We will be back next week with episode number 7 out of 10 of The Detective. and we will talk to you all real soon. You have been listening to The Detective, a Galactic Football League novella. The Detective is also available as an ebook and as a full-length audiobook. If you want the whole story with no waiting, visit scottsigler.com/The Detective for links to Amazon, Audible, and more. Follow Scott on Instagram and Twitter, where he is at Scott Sigler, one word, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Scott Sigler. The Detective audiobook was directed by A.B. Kovacs and engineered by Steve Rickyberg. Copyright 2019, Empty Set Entertainment, all rights reserved. Theme music is from the band Amps and Volts.